I see people are still arriving, so maybe I should wait half a minute or so. Good morning, everybody. My name is Jens Hvidtstedt Hansen. I'm professor of law at Aarhus University in Denmark, and I have the pleasure of being involved as a researcher in the Asylum project with Nick and Sergio and others, coordinated by Sergio at CEPS in Brussels. I would like to welcome all of you to this webinar, which is attempting to combine the various aspects of the Asylum project, in fact. The aim and the focus of the project is to study global asylum governance as reflected in the principles and commitments affirmed in the Global Compact on Refugees. Secondly, we are looking at studying the EU's role as a global actor and as a regional policymaker. And thirdly, against that background, we are also studying and analyzing tendencies and standards of EU law and policy on asylum. If we should try to make a status on the Global Compact of refugees after 3 years since its affirmation by the UN General Assembly in December 2018, we see weak tendencies of engagement by the EU and its member states. There is an interesting question, if not dichotomy, as to whether the EU is seeing the Global Compact as a foreign policy instrument, or it is also including it as an instrument of regional protection and protection responsibility. It was noteworthy that when the European Commission launched its new EU Pact on Asylum and Migration in September 2020, in the core document, the communication on the new pact, the Global Compact is not mentioned at all. There is a little bit of a reference to global, but that is only in terms of global developments, but no specific reference to the Global Compact on refugees. Therefore, one may ask, as it was done recently in a publication by the Norwegian Refugee Council, the International Rescue Committee, and the Danish Refugee Council, looking at the GCR 3 years on, one could ask, as they do, whether states, not least the European states, are effectively undermining the Global Compact on refugees by being constructive abroad but obstructive at home. And this dichotomy, this potential undermining risk, is precisely what we will also include in our perspective of this webinar. We are going to focus not least on externalization practices and policies. And I put it this way, not policy and practice, but practices and policies, because it's somehow turned that way around, that we see externalization practices in various formats. For years, we have seen pushbacks at the EU external borders, sometimes systematic, sometimes discreetly or overtly supported by the EU. And at least, as we have seen in recent years, pushbacks carried out by member states and their authorities with effective impunity, in the sense that the EU does not do much, if anything at all, to prevent these pushbacks. This has recently been exacerbated by the current control crisis at the borders towards Belarus. That is the external borders of the EU member states, Poland, Lithuania, and Latvia, where certain member states have been, as it was argued recently by Sergio Carrera, have been co-manufacturing an emergency and causing political instability to the entire EU. And here we have interesting interactions again between practices and policies. The practices carried out more or less with impunity by these states, openly supported by some member states, and more recently indirectly managed or attempted to be managed by the European Commission in terms of legislative proposals. Also recently, we have seen attempts to systematic externalization of asylum procedures. And this, of course, then raises a question as to which types of externalization we are expecting or can expect to see in the future. And these are the sort of synthetic aims of this webinar, and I'm pleased now to pass the floor to our moderator, Katrine Starup. Katrine is head of the Global Protection Unit at the Danish Refugee Council, DRC, which is also an asylum partner, and she has more than 25 years of experience with humanitarian and displacement work. Katrine has worked with the UN and international and local NGOs in the field and at headquarters, and she has field experience from Africa and Asia. So please, Katrine, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jens, and thanks for that excellent and great introduction and interesting perspectives on indeed the current externalization practices, trends, efforts, and the relation to the role of the EU in implementing the Global Compact on Refugees. So the first Global Refugee Forum, convened in December 2019, in many ways presented a major breakthrough in international refugee protection by way of presenting the strong commitments from both states and non-state actors to a common agenda to increase refugee protection, self-reliance, responsibility sharing, and solidarity for both refugees and refugee hosting countries. We recently also had the first stocktaking event, the high-level officials meeting in December last year, which again confirmed a strong commitment to move forward on the implementation of the Global Compact on Refugees. But it is hard to ignore exactly those multiple parallel developments, attempts, practices, as Jens was alluding to, by states to evade the responsibility for refugees and their protection through third country arrangements and policy changes. And this is the very background to why we wanted to convene today in this event to discuss the relationship between the recent and ongoing externalization proposals and practices and the implementation of the Global Compact on Refugees, specifically the impact of externalization on refugees and asylum seekers and their rights, and what it means to the EU's implementation of the Global Compact on Refugees. As indicated by Jens in his introductory remarks, the perception of the Global Compact on Refugees as a foreign policy rather than also a domestic responsibility, the pick and choose approach that we have seen to the GCR commitments by states, the very blunt attempts by some European states to externalize refugee protection, is undermining the potential that we see in the compact to achieve real progress towards genuine responsibility sharing. While it's key to keep the positive momentum for sure on moving the commitments under the Global Compact on Refugees forward, this will also require an ongoing and open discussion on the contradictory nature of externalization practices and policies and approaches to the Global Compact on Refugees commitments and the risks to international refugee protection and the system that it constitutes. So that is what we're going to talk about today. A couple of practicalities. We have an excellent panel lined up to stimulate this discussion. all with distinct and relevant experiences and insights to this topic of the impact of externalization practices and policies on the protection, the rights, and the lives of asylum seekers and refugees, as well as the broader implications for international refugee protection. We have 4 panelists who will each have 7 to 8 minutes for their first intervention and will be then invited back when we have a Q&A session by the end of this event. You are very much welcome to write your questions, comments in the chat throughout also the panelists' intervention. Please include as relevant indication to whom your question is directed. And then we will have approximately 25, 30 minutes by the end for this Q&A session. And we will pick up the questions then to the extent that time allows. So let me move to the excellent panel we have. And our first speaker, Jeff Crisp, will provide his insights, perspectives on the concept of externalization, its use and impact, the linkages between externalization and the Global Compact on Refugees, and reflect also on the role and position of the UNHCR. Jeff Crisp is a specialist on refugee and migration issue who has worked for the UNHCR, Refugees International, and the Global Commission on International Migration. He brings huge expertise, and he is currently affiliated to the Refugee Studies Centre at Oxford and Chatham House in London. Jeff, the word is yours.
Thank you very much indeed, and welcome to everybody. It's great to be with you. The title of my presentation today is Externalization, the Global Compact on Refugees and UNHCR, some introductory questions. And as the title suggests, this is really a very basic introduction to the whole concept of externalization and its relationship to the Global Compact and the position of UNHCR. And in the next few minutes, I'm going to address 6 specific questions. The first of my questions is, what exactly is externalization? What does this concept actually mean? While the notion of externalization has become central to the contemporary refugee protection discourse, it does not have a formal, legal, or even a commonly agreed definition. For the purpose of this presentation, the concept can be taken to mean those measures that are taken by states beyond their own territorial borders to obstruct or deter the arrival of refugees, asylum seekers, and migrants who do not have official permission to enter their intended country of destination. Externalization, it should be noted, is almost invariably a strategy pursued by countries of the global north with the intention of excluding unwanted arrivals from countries of the global south. The interception of asylum seekers traveling by boat before detaining and processing them in offshore locations is one of the best known forms of this strategy, as is the establishment of deals between wealthier and poorer states, with the latter being offered financial aid and other incentives in return for their cooperation in halting the onward movement of foreign nationals. That then is a brief introduction to the concept of externalization. My second question is, when and where has this strategy been employed? While the notion of externalization is quite a recent one, the strategy itself is by no means new. In the 1930s, maritime interceptions were undertaken by a number of states to prevent the arrival of Jews escaping from Nazism. Coming more up to date in the 1980s and 1990s, the US introduced interdiction and offshore processing arrangements for Cuban and Haitian asylum seekers, while Australia introduced the so-called Pacific solution, whereby asylum seekers were banished to detention centres in the island states of Nauru and Papua New Guinea. Over the past 2 decades, the EU has become increasingly eager to adopt the strategy of externalization. Indeed, the notion of externalization formed the basis of the EU's 2016 deal with Turkey, whereby Ankara agreed to block the onward movement of refugees in exchange for financial support and other rewards from Brussels. Since then, the EU has also supported the Libyan Coast Guard, enabling it to intercept, return, and detain anyone trying to cross the Mediterranean on their way to Europe by boat. At the same time, the Trump and Biden administrations have both used their diplomatic and financial leverage to ensure that Mexico and the states of Central America cooperate in obstructing the northward movement of refugees. Question 3, what have been the results of externalization? While externalization has proved extremely expensive to implement, particularly I should say in the Australian case, states in the global north believe that the tremendous cost involved is a price worth paying to limit the number of asylum seekers arriving on their territory and to retain the support of their electorates. In other respects, however, externalization has had a very wide range of negative consequences, and I can only summarize them briefly this morning. Externalization has enabled the world's most prosperous states to avoid the obligations they incur under the UN Refugee Convention, and it has prevented people from exercising their right to seek asylum in other states. As I'm sure we'll hear from other speakers, it has also put refugees at serious risk of human rights violations, including physical and psychological harm. By closing borders, externalization has placed a disproportionate burden on developing countries, where 85% of the world's refugees are to be found. And as seen in relation to the EU-Turkey deal, it has encouraged the use of refugees as bargaining chips, with less developed countries extracting funding and other concessions from wealthier states in exchange for restrictions on refugee rights. Question 4, what does the Global Compact on Refugees have to say about externalization? The Global Compact on Refugees was formulated between 2016 and 2018 with the noble intention of reinvigorating the international refugee protection regime. One might therefore expect it to address the issue of externalization in a very direct manner. Unfortunately, it does not. The Global Compact does not contain a section or even a single paragraph devoted to the issue of externalization. Some of the key words associated with the externalization strategy, such as offshore processing and interception, do not appear in the text of the Compact at all. The Global Compact talks about, and I quote, an urgent need for more equitable sharing of the burden and responsibility for hosting and supporting the world's refugees, and calls for, and I quote again, mechanisms for the fair and efficient determination of individual international protection claims. But it does not point out how such objectives are undermined by the strategy of externalization. As has already been mentioned in the introductory comments, as a recent evaluation undertaken by the Danish Refugee Council concludes, states in the global north have tended to regard the Global Compact as a means of addressing refugee situations in the global south, while leaving their own asylum policies untouched. And I quote from that evaluation, Denmark's recent pursuit of the externalization of asylum procedures, it concludes, illustrate the growing disconnect between strong donor support for the Global Compact in relation to refugees and host communities abroad, and a different agenda at home, which frequently undermines the international protection regime. End of quote. My fifth question is, what position has UNHCR taken on the issue of externalization? In 2019, I undertook an extensive review of recent UNHCR speeches, statements, and other documents, and came to the very clear conclusion that the organization had not responded in a very systematic way to the challenge of externalization and had failed to articulate a clear policy on the issue. despite its evident threat to refugee protection principles. One can only speculate why this was the case. My personal view is that UNHCR felt seriously intimidated by the Trump administration's overtly hostile attitude towards refugees and the United Nations, and feared that it might be confronted with funding cuts of the type already inflicted on the World Health Organization and UNRWA, the Palestinian Refugee Agency. Confronted with this threat, I think, the organization's natural inclination was to look for financial and diplomatic support from the European Union, which, in the wake of the 2015-16 refugee emergency in Europe, had firmly embraced the notion of externalization. It was in this context, I believe, that UNHCR chose to adopt a very muted position on the issue. What I'm pleased to say is that that situation has changed considerably in the past 2 years. In 2020, the High Commissioner Filippo Grandi spoke of, I quote, UNHCR's firm opposition to the externalization proposals of some politicians, which are not only contrary to the law, but which offer no practical solutions to the problems that force people to flee. In 2021, last year, the Assistant High Commissioner for Protection, Gillian Triggs, began to speak much more freely on the issue of externalization, observing that, and I quote, UNHCR is absolutely dismayed that some of our strongest supporters historically are now playing with the idea of externalizing their responsibilities and shifting burden to poor countries. She also went on to say that she considered externalization to be a form of neo-colonialism, which was quite a strong statement coming from a senior UN official. Such reservations about externalization were expressed more formally in an official note on externalization, also published in 2021, after mounting pressure from civil society and refugee advocacy organizations. While such statements are very much to be welcomed, I do want to point out that UNHCR has nevertheless been very reluctant to make any direct and public criticism of the EU's externalization strategy with respect to refugees in Libya, where the strategy of externalization has taken its most extreme and cruel form. To end this brief presentation, what then is the future of externalization? As time is short, I won't address this issue in any depth, but let me just conclude with some points that we may want to discuss in the Q&A that is to come later. Are there litigation and advocacy strategies that civil society might use to counter externalization? Second question is, how can UNHCR be persuaded to maintain and indeed strengthen its position on the question of externalization? Are there any ways in which the considerable resources associated with externalization strategies can be used to enhance refugee protection? And finally, to what extent do safe and legal routes to asylum, or complementary pathways as they are referred to by UNHCR, provide a rights-based alternative to externalization? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jeff. Excellent. And for setting the scene of this discussion and bringing in the concept of externalization, its impact, the relationship with the Global Compact on Refugees, and also the role of both UNHCR and civil society. Without further ado, we'll move to our second speaker, Sitara Mohammadi, who will offer your reflections on the human cost of externalization policies, speaking from the perspective of the impact of Australian asylum policies on the lives of asylum seekers and refugees. Learning from the Australian experiences and the effect of its asylum policies and practices are central at a time where multiple European states are introducing similar ideas and approaches. Sitara is a former refugee from Afghanistan who has a BA in International Relations and Human Rights from Monash University in Melbourne. She spent 2019 as a provost scholar at the University of Oxford where she completed her dissertation on Australia's refugee policy. She is currently undertaking her Juris Doctorate at the Monash Law School. Sitara, the word is yours.
Thanks very much, Catherine, for the introductions. Good morning, good evening, wherever you may be in the world. I would like to begin, as we do here in Australia, by acknowledging the traditional owners and custodians of the land from which I join you today, the Wurundjeri peoples, and pay my respects to their elders past, present, and those yet to emerge. For decades, refugees and people seeking asylum by boat have dominated both domestic and regional policies here in Australia. Refugee policy remains, as discussed earlier, in the hands of states, especially in the global north, including Australia, those in the European Union and the United States, which are increasingly seeking external solutions to the movement of those who are seeking asylum. So what has been some of the implications of the policy of externalization here in Australia? Firstly, Australia has sought to deny access to its territory, primarily through border control and preventing the arrival of boats to its shores. This has involved a series of border control policies designed to intercept, interdict, and detain refugees and people seeking asylum before they reach Australia's borders. Border control is now a matter of prevention of access rather than processing those seeking access. In the context of Australia, border control is used to prevent refugees from leaving places like Indonesia and arriving in Australian waters. It can therefore be said that refugees in places like Indonesia are directly impacted by Australia's policy of externalization. There are approximately 14,000 registered refugees currently stranded in Indonesia, unable to access any form of durable solution. More than half of these number, that is approximately 7,600, are Afghan refugees, majority of whom are ethnic Hazaras, who have long been persecuted in Afghanistan, particularly under the Taliban. Before 2014, Australia resettled a substantial number of the refugees from Indonesia through the UNHCR. However, as of 13th of June 2014, the Australian government adopted a policy whereby refugees who registered with the UNHCR in Indonesia would never be resettled in Australia, even if they had family members here. This policy has led the Australian government to pursue extraterritorial strategies that therefore contain refugees and people seeking asylum within Indonesia and removing their ability for forward migration to Australia. A significant number of the refugees in Indonesia have family members who have arrived in Australia by boat before 2014, but nonetheless do not qualify for resettlement in Australia through family reunification pathways. For most of those refugees and people seeking asylum in Indonesia, the country was never really intended to be, the country was only ever intended to be a transit point en route to a destination like Australia. However, Indonesia has not proved to be a transit country, as most of those refugees have spent more than 8 years there, and in some cases up to 13 years. These stranded refugees face several severe issues, all of which have exacerbated since the global pandemic. Above all, the refugees feel trapped in limbo. They cannot return to their country of origin, for example, places like Afghanistan, but they also cannot integrate locally, as Indonesia is not a signatory to the 1951 Refugee Convention. This means that their only option is to sit and wait for resettlement to a third country. However, waiting times for resettlement are extremely lengthy, and only very limited places are available. For example, in 2021, only 179 refugees were able to resettle to a third country. Therefore, refugees face prolonged uncertainty, with their lives remaining on hold. So therefore, refugee situation in Indonesia is extremely dire. There are ongoing social issues within the refugee communities of which the UNHCR actually appears unaware of. Refugees face significant mental health problems and suicide is only increasing. A few weeks ago, for example, a 22-year-old man set himself on fire in protest at the restrictions on education, work, and the ability to exercise, and prolonged waiting time in Indonesia. In the last 3 years only, around 14 refugees have suicided in Indonesia, and many others have died of natural causes or have become homeless. Even when, in some cases, people do have a right to primary education, it is not accredited or does not lead to any form of higher education. There are no measures to support the mental health of refugees, and this deterioration of situation in places like Afghanistan is a great cause of trauma and distress to many of the refugees there. Secondly, Australia has expelled asylum seekers from mainland to another state. As Chris mentioned earlier, this has eventuated by deals between Australia and poorer states in our region. Even when processing claims have resulted in the positive determination of refugees, Australia has nonetheless denied access to entry into mainland Australia and decided to detain the refugees offshore. This has happened in the form of offshore processing, which was established in 2001 under the Howard government, who created what became known as the Pacific Solution. In essence, Australia excised around 5,000 islands from Australia's migration zone and stated that people seeking asylum who did arrive by boat would then be transferred to those countries in the Pacific, namely Nauru and Manus Island on Papua New Guinea, for their claims to be processed offshore. These new systems sought to remove all refugees physically outside of Australia's borders and to make access to Australia's protection, the court system, and any measures of review channels almost impossible. Under the same government, a new type of visa was introduced, known as the Temporary Protection Visa, or TPV. This new visa meant that anyone who did arrive in Australia by boat were no longer eligible for permanent protection, rather that they were only eligible for a 3-year TPV visa. One of the principal rationales behind introducing this type of visa was that it would help stop the arrival of boats and deter people from coming to Australia, as they would never be able to resettle in Australia permanently. In July of 2013, then Prime Minister Kevin Rudd went a step further and said that refugees who arrived in Australia by boat would not only have their claims processed offshore, but they would never be resettled in Australia. They would remain on the Pacific nations of PNG and Nauru. Some 200 refugees are still detained on those camps. Thirdly, refugees who have arrived in Australia before the policies were changed continue to live in our communities and continue to live in states of uncertainty. Some 30,000 refugees and people seeking asylum remain on TPV visas despite living in Australia between 8 and 13 years. They are on TPVs, so they're required to have their status reassessed every 3 and every 5 years, depending on their visa types. And of course, this means that people are often living in various kinds of psychological limbo, away from their family and loved ones, not knowing whether they'll be at risk of being returned to their country of origin, where they fear significant harm and persecution, or whether they will remain in Australia. Living in this type of uncertainty and limbo makes dealing with the trauma that they have experienced by making the voyage to Australia, as well as living and building a new life in Australia, very, very difficult. They have been living in states of destitution, and several of them have committed suicide throughout the years, primarily due to the punitive policies of the Australian government. Despite ongoing violence and instability in many countries of origin, Afghanistan, for example, of which many of the refugees have fled from, the Australian government have said that 30,000 people on TPVs will not be granted permanent protection in Australia. Furthermore, 32 men are currently held in immigration detention here in Melbourne, 25 of whom have been given refugee status, where most of the men came to Australia by boat in either 2012 or 2013. Their detention is costing Australian taxpayers millions of dollars per year. Psychological studies have demonstrated that on every measure, TPV holders have far greater mental health and psychiatric issues, including depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress disorders when compared to permanent visa holders. The Australian policy was designed to be a collective punishment, to show how cruel it can be to seek asylum in this country, to deter others from seeking refuge and exercising their enshrined human rights law. The cumulative impact of Australia's externalization policy, both on people's physical and mental health, amounts to degrading treatment under international human rights law. We know that there are high levels of self-harm, that people are suffering significant trauma and mental distress, and this will only prolong further as people continue to live in detention facilities indefinitely, live in states of limbo here in mainland Australia, or remain stranded in places like Indonesia. Refugees have made the risky and dangerous journey to places like Australia, often by boat, as they have faced persecution and their lives were in danger in their home countries. So while Australia's refugee policies are hugely problematic both domestically and regionally, as it continues to punish those who are seeking or attempting to seek protection here, it is also tremendously problematic around the world, as has been highlighted, as many European states, including the UK now, Sweden and Denmark, are trying to replicate some of these punitive policies to send refugees offshore and remove them from mainland Europe. Several others.
I hate to, but we will have to wrap up, please.
If I can have 30 more seconds, thank you.
Thank you.
So in conclusion, the policy of offshore processing and externalization aims to stop people trying to come to places like Australia. The policy and practice of externalization of refugees here in Australia and in Europe now tries to absolve state responsibility under international law to protect those who seek refuge and asylum. It costs millions of dollars. It is inhumane and extremely punitive. Ultimately, externalization of the refugee policy has resulted in the erosion of refugee protection. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sitara, and very good and to hear about the huge impact on people, the human costs of the externalization policies and practices, and how indeed that is also unfortunately inspiring other states to follow suit. We will move to another part of the world, but continue to hear more about the on-the-ground impact of externalization policies and practices. Moving to our third speaker on the panel, Monica Matos, who will provide an on-the-ground account from the humanitarian and political situation at the Polish-Belarus border. So while numbers of people arriving and being trapped at the border have decreased, the situation has largely disappeared from the attention of the international media. The protection crisis there is still very real and unfolding. The situation has triggered a host of concerning policy proposals and measures, both at national and EU level, which in different ways attempt to limit access to asylum and derogate from essential rights and procedural safeguards for people who are seeking asylum. So Monica Matos works at Grupa Granica, a network of Polish NGOs and activists, where she's been directly involved in supporting people stuck at the border in very harsh conditions, Monica has a background in Polish civil society working on communications and advocacy on climate change and on migration and migrant rights. Monica, over to you for a 10-minute intervention, please.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Sitara, also for this intervention. It was very moving for me. Let me just tell you, I'm now exactly at the place, at the land where it has happened over last months. So for us, it has been a landmark for Poland, a beautiful forest space, a beautiful, tourist places. And this has become a land of humanitarian disaster and pain and despair over last months. And this is a short story how Poland joined a shameful round of countries which are very effectively preventing people from, first of all, entering its borders, but second of all, from having access to the normal, so to speak, asylum procedure. Since September last year, we have experienced a lot of people trying to cross the border between Poland and Belarus, and first, the first steps from the Polish side, we saw there was a bit more heavy militarization of the border, a little bit more of protection, etc. At some point of time in the beginning of September, human rights, migrants activists realized that a lot of people started to be stranded at the border. So in practice, they were just simply kept at bay by Polish border guards and denied entry. And, they just stayed in a sort of like harsh weather, nature conditions without any shelter, any food, any water, without medical treatment and anything. And that was the first, the first images that we had. And then the help sort of broke loose. In October, November, and December, we had hundreds and hundreds of people weekly trying to pass through the border between Poland and Belarus. As you probably know, or some of you know, this is very harsh and very heavy to cross area. Parts of this border are covered in a primeval forest, which actually migrants call a jungle, a very dangerous jungle. There is obviously huge foreign trees, swamps, etc. The migrants are usually being brought from Minsk or Grodno, from places in Belarus, by buses to the border itself, and then at a convenient time pushed through the fences, through the razor wire, by the Belarusian guards. And then if they meet the Polish border guards, they are pushed back again. So that results in them being stranded for days and for weeks, without food, without shelter, without medical help, in a very, very harsh conditions. It is a forest in which you basically can get lost, even if you're experienced with it, even if you are super prepared, equipped, etc. It is a forest with wolves, with bisons, very sort of wild nature environment. At the same time, in September 2021, Polish government, in a reaction to this situation, established a legislation very quickly, sort of overnight, to establish emergency zone, so-called emergency zone, all along the border, which resulted in the fact that nobody apart from locally living people could enter into the zone, like few kilometers wide along the border. No humanitarian aid, no medical aid, no international organizations, just the local inhabitants and army and border patrol. Obviously, that's just like deepened the crisis. We started as a civil society to organize ourselves. And I think it won't be overstatement if I say we organized something like a underground railroad, or I don't know how else to call it, but like a huge whole system of actually providing humanitarian help to the people stranded on the border in the forest, leading them out of there without being noticed by border patrol, providing medical aid to them, providing some sort of a power of attorney to many of them, providing media attention to them, etc., etc. All of this in the conditions where all of our activities are and publicly are named as a crime against the Polish state. So just to give you a gist of it, in practice, imagine that in 2021, you're crawling through the super dark and dangerous forest, like in a survival game, avoiding border patrol, avoiding Polish army, just to bring a couple of bottles of water, baby formula, diapers, and food to people who are hiding somewhere and waiting for your help. That sounds kind of like unbelievable, but that's what we have been doing over last months. In November, there was a kind of like a big amassment of people on the Belarusian side, which we all have seen, and we still all don't know what was it, like exactly if it was a show of force by Lukashenko. However, that again resulted in a even much more heavy militarization and the presence of some sort of paramilitary troops in the region, etc. More harassment of activists, more harassment of refugees, more direct pushbacks. We had accounts of migrants who said, we have been pushed back a dozen of times, 10 times. We spent here 1 month, 2 months. We have found bodies. There is probably much more bodies in this forest. And even though, like in comparison to the whole world, these numbers are not so huge, it's just really probably a couple of thousands of people. If you imagine that there was no professionals involved in this help and no professional international organization, being at this spot, that's a very huge numbers for us. Poland has no migration policy whatsoever. People who have arrived and whose pushbacks we effectively prevented are now being kept in sort of detention camps, closed detention camps usually. The procedures are not clear. The asylum seeking procedure is not being implemented in many cases. In many cases, they really don't know even if they can enter the procedure because of the current Polish emergency legislation. And additionally to that, somebody called it an impunity with which Poland, as just yet another EU member state, is implementing the pushbacks. I don't think it's impunity. I think what we have observed with many advocacy appeals to UNHCR, to EU, to IOM, our sort of maybe social movement or activist point of view is that there was actually a very silent agreement from the EU side and a very silent, hands clapping at what Poland is doing at the Polish-Belarusian border. And factually condemning people to death, because that's how we call it. The pushbacks resulted in many deaths, in many, many tragedies that could have been avoided over these last months. That's very gist of it. I'm happy to answer more questions in the later session. Yeah, thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Monica, for a very also hard account from the ground again, this time at the border, Belarus and Poland. We will move to our last speaker before we open up for the Q&A session. Nicholas Feith-Tan, Dr. Nicholas Feith-Tan will point of departure in the recent change to Danish asylum law, allowing for externalizing asylum processing and refugee protection, explore the Danish proposal to provide reflections Nicholas, you will talk about the Danish proposal and provide reflections on the future of externalization policies and approaches, also in a European context, including in relations to the commitments under the Global Compact on Refugees. So Nicholas Tan is a senior researcher at the Danish Institute for Human Rights and an asylum researcher also. He's also a senior research associate of the Refugee Law Initiative. And Nicholas has consulted with Amnesty International, the Danish Refugee Council, UNHCR, on various aspects of international protection. Nicholas, the word is yours.
Thanks so much, Katrina. It's great to be back with Asyl, and my warm thanks to both my Asyl colleagues and DRC colleagues for putting today's seminar together. And finally, thank you so much, Monica and Sitara, for your really compelling accounts of externalization in practice. What I'm going to be speaking to today, I guess, is what might be called a potential future form of externalization, or indeed externalization in slow motion from the Danish side. And I should note before I begin that I'm speaking on my own terms as a researcher and not on behalf of the Danish Institute for Human Rights as such. So in my brief intervention today, I'm going to try and do four things. First, sketch the Danish proposal for you if you're not aware of it. Second, discuss European international reactions to it. Thirdly, speak to the future of these externalization approaches in Europe. And finally, offer some reflections on the relationship between externalization and the Global Compact that Jeff so eloquently set out for us. So firstly, on the Danish legislation, as some of you would know, on the 3rd of June last year, the Danish Parliament passed a legislative amendment to the Aliens Act, allowing for the transfer of asylum seekers to a third country outside the EU for the purposes of both the asylum procedure and indeed the protection of those found to be refugees in the third country. The amendment provides that transfers can only take place under an international agreement between Denmark and the third state, and that asylum seekers are to be transferred unless it would be in breach of Denmark's international obligations. However, because the legislation does envisage an international agreement between the two states, any such instrument will need the approval of the Danish Parliament before being implemented. Of course, a number of potential partner or cooperating states have been suggested, including most notably, I think, Rwanda. So the amendment essentially presents the Danish proposal in three phases. The first, of course, is asylum seekers arriving spontaneously to Danish territory, where they'll receive an individual screening from the Danish Immigration Service with automatic appeal to the Refugee Appeals Board. The proposal to the law did not detail which asylum seekers would be exempted from transfer, but did provide a number of rather general examples. For example, nationals from the third state itself, asylum seekers with family in Denmark, and seriously ill persons. The second phase, of course, is the asylum procedure, which should take place in the third country. And it's a requirement that that state has ratified and in fact respects the 1951 Refugee Convention. However, the law did not specify which minimum safeguards must be in place for such an asylum procedure, nor address the potential discrepancies between national asylum law in Denmark on the one hand and national asylum law in the third country. Moreover, the proposal did not address which government will be responsible for the asylum procedure, and seems thus to be adopted on the basis that either Danish asylum authorities could be posted in the third state, or indeed the third country's asylum authorities would assume responsibility. Equally, the law is silent on the material conditions in such a processing centre. Thirdly, of course, the proposal envisages that refugee protection will in fact take place in the third country, and takes, in my view, a particularly narrow position on the rights afforded to refugees. So the amendment requires that the third state rather be a party to the 1951 Convention. And this includes a practical respect for the principles of non-refoulement, but nothing more. So this rather minimalist position, in my view, would seem to ignore the extensive catalogue of refugee rights granted under the 1951 Convention, including, of course, rights to education, employment, housing, freedom of movement, and right to identity documents. The reactions to the Danish amendment were swift, negative, and largely dismissive. The European Commission noted that the external processing of asylum is not possible under existing EU rules or proposals under the new pact. UNHCR has reiterated many times, I think now, that the Danish proposal risks undermining the foundation of the international protection system. And as Jeff has noted, UNHCR has been increasingly vocal on the risks of externalization in general, and indeed the Danish proposal in particular. On the other hand, the Austrian government expressed positive interest, calling the policy a compelling approach. And of course, in late June of 2021, the UK government introduced legislation of its own, currently before the House of Lords. The Nationality and Borders Bill is a broad sweeping piece of legislation, but does propose to relax safe third country rules to allow for the transfers of asylum seekers to offshore British territories or indeed third states. In August of 2021, the African Union released a statement strongly condemning the Danish proposal as, quote, completely unacceptable and, quote, an abdication of international responsibility. And this statement, of course, is an indication that the African Union's 55 member states are presently unwilling to enter into cooperation. That said, I think, in my view at least, the Rwandan government's silence is becoming somewhat louder in this context, and I'm not aware of any explicit rejections of potential cooperation on the Danish idea. So to move then to the broader context of future externalization approaches, what we see, I think, from the Danish example is that rather than a Danish-led reform of European asylum policy, it is rather a unilateral attempt to minimise asylum obligations and indeed to deter future asylum seekers from arriving in Denmark. The scale of the vision has significantly diminished. Rather than replacing spontaneous asylum, there indeed will be rather broad exceptions to transfer, meaning that the number of asylum seekers actually subject to any future policy is likely to be very, very low. And perhaps more broadly, from a legal perspective, of course, Denmark's opt-out from key parts of the EU asylum acquis would seem to render the Danish proposal legally possible in Denmark, where it would not be in other EU member states. While the uptake of the Danish approach at EU level would thus seem highly unlikely, there of course remains the possibility of a coalition of the willing of certain European states outside the EU asylum acquis joining the Danish externalization push. One thing seems certain in this regard, and that is that the vision of externalizing asylum among global North states is not going away anytime soon. And in my final 2 minutes then, some quick reflections on externalization and the Global Compact. In my view, 3 years after the passage of the GCR, the original sin of the compact is becoming crystal clear. The GCR did not address access to asylum, and this gap allows states to be seen to honour commitments under the compact on the one hand, while seeking to externalise protection and responsibility on the other. The GCR indeed encourages international cooperation, but not of this type. And it's difficult to see the Danish proposal as a form of equitable and fair responsibility sharing. However, the non-binding and general nature of the GCR and the generality of its language do not create genuine pushback against the Danish proposal. And in my view, the many rather vague references to responsibility sharing without defining the term leave the concept open to co-option. And finally, to touch on a point that Jeff raised, there is of course this question whether resettlement and complementary pathways, these controlled routes to protection, can effectively replace spontaneous asylum in the global north. And this expansion of such pathways is one of the 4 objectives of the compact. So given the attraction of these controlled routes to protection, the compact would seem to imply that resettlement and complementary pathways at scale can effectively replace spontaneous asylum and provide a form of responsibility sharing. The reality is that so far this is not happening. There is not the scale in place to support such a notion. And given there are no legal obligations to resettle or provide complementary pathways, I wonder if it is a viable way forward to ensure EU and other global north states do share responsibility for refugees. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nick, for including the panelists of excellent interventions. And we have received many good questions in the chat. So I'll, without further ado, I'll bring some of these questions and comments back to you in the panel. And starting out with the questions, there are 2 questions that are primarily addressed to you, Sitara and Monica, but also, of course, Jeff and Nick, please feel free to come in on that. But there will be a second round of questions also that can be addressed to you as well. So the first question is actually about returning to the Jeff's question posed in the beginning about the opportunities for civil society engagement in countering externalization policies and approaches. And this was followed up with a question from the chat on how indeed we can convince governments, voters, that accept their refugee protection responsibilities, not by law, not only as an obligation, but also as a positive for these countries. For example, to increase diversity and address population issues, working force, I guess also. So that was the first question, Sitara and Monica, for you. And then Monica, there's one specifically for you, appreciating your account. And if you could please elaborate a little bit on the current situation. Do you have a sense of how many people are still stranded? Are there exceptions to the pushback practice and examples of more people who have access to asylum procedures? So over to you. I don't know, maybe Monica, if you would like to start. And then I'll hand over to you after Sitara, please. Thank you.
Okay, I can start and try to be brief. At the moment, the situation has calmed down a lot. Just to give you like a sort of a perspective, in October, November, beginnings of December, we had like around maybe 500 people asking us for help weekly. Now we had the first 3 weeks of January, which is the last time so a week ago, which is the last time I checked, we had close to 400 people who has asked us for help, because we have a sort of like an alarm phone system. And the situation is that we never really know how many people are stranded on the Belarusian side, which is also very difficult to work with, so to speak. We never really know how many people are somewhere in between. And actually, since the beginning of January, what we learn is that it's never over. Every time we think it's over, it's never over. So actually, just last night, I was out on an intervention with 2 teenagers from Rwanda. I'm just nodding to Nick because we were just talking about Rwanda. Who came from there's quite a lot of people from African countries who came on student visas to Russia and to Belarus. and now use this way to cross into EU. So that's another, you know, new sort of trickling path of people. Exceptions of pushbacks. To the current situation. One more thing is that we know of a lot of people waiting in Minsk and Grodno and other cities in Belarus who kind of like want to wait until the winter passes, at least a little bit. So the common expectations is that this will pick up again in March. And we know of a lot of people who, couple of thousands of people who have been, well, not deported, but officially, but like brought back from Belarus to countries where they came from, which I'm sure you've heard of. However, just yesterday, Belarus opened a new, they call it a touristic office in India, in Delhi. But this is exactly a cover for this type of operations. So like organizing the whole trip, which ends on the border, and, you know, then they push people. So we don't really know what's going to happen. The exceptions of pushbacks, there were, like, of course, many people are now in Poland. Around close to 2,000 people are in detention centers. I know it's not a lot, but for Poland, it's a huge number. What we observed on basically on the border over this last month, it was that it was a very individual decision by a specific border guard and by a specific situation. So we've seen really horrid pushbacks of families with small children, of elderly people, of people with, I know specifically of a situation with a person who has multiple sclerosis and has this really hard time moving and, has severe disabilities. And this person has been pushed back, I think 5 times exactly. So, sometimes there was just a good luck or a pity from the side of border guard, but there were no official guidelines, so to speak, for pushbacks, who is pushed back and who is not. When we organize ourselves very quickly, we discovered that if there is a possibility, if people want to ask for asylum for Poland, or if there actually are, we see as it is happening that they are being caught by a border guard, and then we need to bring to the spot media, MEPs, if possible, the whole world, so to speak, to prevent the pushback. And then sometimes it worked. So that would be this one exception, when there was a lot of media attention on this one family or this one case, that maybe the pushback, then is avoided. I don't know if there was any other question to specifically to me.
Thank you, Monica, and thanks a lot for that elaboration, but also sharing your ideas of what you already do in terms of the opportunities as a civil society actor on the ground. Sitara, I also wanted to give the chance for you in terms of opportunities for civil society and activists as such, in terms of engaging to counter externalization, but also what can we do to convince our governments and the voters to address this issue. Sitara, over to you. Thanks.
Thanks, Catherine, and thanks, Jamie, for the important question. I think at the very core of the question and also the response is that refugees are human beings. I think it's, for a long time, that's been forgotten from the discussions, the narrative, and the discourse on refugees, about refugees. We often talk of refugees as numbers, as figures, as statistics, but ultimately these are human beings, just like you and I, who just need protection and safety and just looking to live a better life. I think it's important, particularly in places like Europe and Australia, to use your votes. We have an election coming up in May here in Australia, and I know, and I urge our fellow Australians to use their votes to push for better policy, to push for better protection for refugees and those who seek our safety and our protection here in Australia. So I think it's really important to humanize the issue of refugees, that these are just ordinary human beings. They're not scary. I think for a long time, it's been politicized, it's been criminalized, it's been externalized and securitized, that refugees are coming to our shores, to our borders, to take over our homes, our jobs, our way of life, and to change all that. But as I think I've demonstrated in the last 15 years in Australia, I sought asylum here, I sought refuge here, and now I'm contributing to the Australian, I hope positively, to the Australian society and more broadly to the global community now. I think there are so many positive examples of refugees who have had the chance to resettle to places like Europe and Australia. And I think it's really important to really highlight that to our governments. And I think in terms of diversity and how we can push for a positive image is just really highlighting the valuable skills and talents that refugees bring to our shores in terms of food, richness, culture, and just the many, many different talents that they bring to our countries.
Thank you so much, Sitara, and for that strong encouragement, and indeed the changing the narrative also about this. I have a couple of questions that might be more directed at you, Jeff and Nick, but again, please, in the whole panel, please feel free to come in also. And I wanted to encourage you, and there are some specific questions, for example, for you, Jeff, in the chat, to encourage you to respond to those also as you see fit, and likewise for the rest of you. We will not manage to bring in all the questions, but I have two here that I want to take in the next round and see if we can manage that. So one question is actually several panelists you have mentioned, and this may be directed to you, Nick, in the first instance. To what extent can safe and legal routes to asylum replace spontaneous asylum and provide a rights-based alternative to externalization? This was the very question also posed by you, Jeff, in the beginning. I would like to bring this question back to us now and to you in the panel, because asking about, does a stronger focus on resettlement entail the risk of strengthening externalization, since selection and determination of refugee status happens abroad? And what could be done to minimize these risks? So that's one question. I'll dare to take one more, which is directed specifically at you, Jeff, but again, please feel free. Do you consider externalization practices, the wall built by France with British contribution on the France side of the channel, to prevent illegal immigrants from accessing the UK, and the fences built by Spain to prevent Moroccan and sub-Saharan immigrants from gaining access to Spain? Do you consider this externalization practices? I think I'll leave it there for now for you to come in. Would you want to start, Nick? And then we'll move to you, Jeff, after. Thank you.
Thanks, Katrina. I'll be brief to give Jeff the floor, but with respect to Tobias's question about the role of resettlement and the sort of relationship between resettlement and externalization, I think my advice here for civil society in particular is to see the whole field, to see that there are linkages often between resettlement and restrictions on access to asylum, and to be aware of the dynamics at play on both sides of that delineation. I personally think that resettlement has a quite crucial role to play. It addresses rather different groups of refugees very often. But of course, we should be very critical and aware of attempts to essentially instrumentalize resettlement, as we've seen through the EU-Turkey statement, for example. So my broad advice would be to see the whole field. While I've got the floor, I thought I'd also come in on Chloe's question on the role of cities in combating externalization. I think this is quite a promising path. I agree with you, Chloe, that cities are increasingly having a sort of place at the table. On the other hand, of course, national governments retain ultimate authority as gatekeepers on access to territory, and this we cannot escape, I think. But I do believe municipal and local and regional governments can play a counterbalancing role at times against national restrictive tendencies. So yes, there is potential here. And finally, Amelia's question on next steps on the Danish proposal, if I could just say briefly, I mean, essentially the search goes on for the Danish government to find this partner country. As I've mentioned, Rwanda seems to be the forerunner, indeed maybe one of the only states who are still considering this possibility. And if it goes ahead, I would expect a rather small scale pilot initially. Over to you, Jeff.
Thanks very much, Nick. I don't want to be too academic, but I think it might be worth a little bit of time on the very concept of externalization and the way it's been used. One of my colleagues here in Oxford has criticized the concept, and it's become too broad, and that all refugee policy everywhere is now considered to be symptoms or manifestations of externalization. So going back to what I said, and before I go back to what I said, I should refer you to a really good article that Nick published in the most recent edition of Forced Migration Review, which to me is a kind of definitive article on the notion of externalization and what it actually means. Going back to my own presentation, I mentioned that the key element of externalization, as far as I'm concerned, is it's action taken by states beyond their own territorial borders. And in that respect, I would not include pushbacks of the type that we've seen on the Poland-Belarus border as necessarily being a manifestation of externalization. I mean, to use James Hathaway's language, I would call that a non-entree policy rather than an externalization policy. So going back to the examples raised in the very good question in the chat, the cooperation between the UK and France on the French side of the border, whereby the UK paid for the fortification of the Channel port in Calais, I would certainly see that as a form of externalization. When it comes to Spain strengthening its borders in its two enclaves in Morocco, then I would probably not see that necessarily as a form of externalization. But I do take the opinion that there is a risk of the notion becoming too broad, and that we should try to be a little bit more precise in what it includes and what it doesn't include. I would certainly share the concern that one of our questions has raised about whether resettlement and other forms of safe and legal routes or complementary pathways, as they're called by UNHCR, can replace spontaneous asylum seeking. My answer to that would be a very clear no. And there is obviously a very great danger that states will establish very small resettlement or orderly complementary pathway programs, which let in a few hundred or a few thousand people, and then used those pathways as an excuse to introduce draconian restrictions on spontaneous asylum seekers. We've seen that very, very clearly here in the UK with the Nationality and Borders Bill, which Nick mentioned earlier, which really seeks to establish a kind of a two-tier refugee system. One, the good refugees who come by means of resettlement or complementary pathways, and the bad refugees who show up on British soil and claim asylum here, particularly those coming across the Channel from France. The UK, I think, has been mesmerized by the Australian experience and has felt for a number of years that it can just take the Australian model and transplant it very easily to the UK and make it work. And I think that has proven not to be the case. There's been a lot of proposals, particularly about having pushbacks in the Channel so that people are sent straight back to France. Belatedly, I think the government has realised that that can't be done without the cooperation of France. And particularly since Brexit, such cooperation is not forthcoming. So I think there's been a lot of naive thinking, particularly here in the UK, about the potential for externalisation. I think whatever is done in terms of resettlement and complementary pathways, states will always need asylum systems which can deal in a fair and effective and efficient way with people who arrive and seek asylum. once they arrive. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Jens, did you want to come in for a short remark?
If any of the panelists have anything to say right now, I would rather refrain or come back later. So that will be up to you, Katrina.
Okay. In that case, I think indeed we are moving towards a closure. And before I hand over to Sergio Carrera for the closing remarks, I wanted to give all panelists a chance for 1 minute. Last recommendation from your side. Thank you so much for your wonderful and inspiring and also really heartbreaking accounts and reflections on externalization and how we can move forward with the implementation of the Global Compact on Refugees, taking account of exactly these current and ongoing externalization practices and policies. So what I wanted to ask all 4 of you is to, if you should point to one recommendation to policymakers on how to achieve progress on genuine responsibility sharing as per the Global Compact on Refugees, genuine responsibility sharing by states, what would your recommendation be? Should we start with you, Sitara? Is that all right? And then we'll go.
No worries.
Yeah, thank you.
Sure, I can go, and I'll keep it to 1 minute this time. I think, as I mentioned before, and I don't want to repeat the remarks that I made earlier, I think it's really important to begin with humanizing the issue around refugees. I mentioned that it's been politicized hugely over the last several decades, and now in Australia, and now that's been replicated in Europe as well. I think if states are genuinely, and I highlight genuinely, interested in sharing some of those responsibilities around refugees, and I don't generally like to use the word burden because I think there's a lot of negative connotations attached to that. I think it's important, like I mentioned, to humanize the issues, to really understand that people who are compelled to make those really dangerous journeys to places like Europe by the sea and to places like Australia are really doing so out of need and out of urgency, that their lives are in danger and they need protection and safety. And secondly, really to increase some of those quotas. I think it's important that most of the time the refugees are told to wait in lines, in queues until their turns, and they can only do that when they have a relative chance at getting a resettlement to third countries through the UNHCR program. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sitara. Monica, over to you for 1 minute.
I would agree first with Sitara that humanizing human stories it's extremely important. We've seen it firsthand here now in Poland. We had a very bad reputation of migrants and refugees, broadcasted by our current government after 2015 and 16 crisis, and we were expecting a very bad welcome here when the crisis on the border started. But since we started very quickly working with media and showing stories of people who passed and showing the horrid conditions of their journey, I think right now the public opinion has shifted quite a lot in Poland on refugees and migrants. So over the couple of months, and I think that's a huge work to be done, but it has to be done continuously all the time, not only during crises, but sort of like being taken into account all the time. And the second thing, which for me, and I think for all of the people here is a bit forgotten, is the long-term perspective for governments because and institutions, because sort of we all know that this is not going to stop, not only like on the Polish-Belarusian border, but genuinely speaking, we all see what's happening in the world, and keeping people at bay by building the walls is, we all know it's not a solution. So I guess that's like a huge, obviously, existential question for the global community, what to do with migration. But yeah, that's probably a gist, that we need to think long term about this. And the current response and the current approach to migrants and refugees all around the world is just shameful. And I mean, it's not going to stop them from coming.
Thank you, Monica. Thanks so much. Jeff, 1 minute, please.
Yeah, thanks very much. Yeah, a couple of comments from me. I mean, if you listen to many states and what they say about refugees, you would imagine that the whole international refugee regime was something invented by Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, or UNHCR. And in fact, it wasn't. The international refugee regime was set up by states because it suited their own interests, because they wanted refugee issues to be dealt with in a predictable, cooperative, and humane manner. And I would argue that externalization actually strikes at the heart of the refugee regime in the sense that it undermines the whole notion of responsibility sharing, which is so central to that regime. And I think we have to, my recommendation would be to say that we've got to a stage where responsibility sharing is too often seen in terms of the global south keeps the refugees on its territory and the global north pays for the costs of keeping them on its territory. And I don't think that's a viable model anymore in a globalized world. And unfortunately, I would say that I think, to echo something that Nick said earlier, I think the Global Compact actually reinforces that impression with its strong emphasis on kind of development aid in the global south and its lack of attention to access to asylum and to responsibility sharing in the global north. So I would say that going forward, if we are to use the Global Compact as a basis for future advocacy, let's point out some of the gaps in the compact and particularly address the way in which externalization is absent from it. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. Over to you, Nick, for the last comment before we move to Sergio. Thank you. 1 minute.
Thanks all. 2 quick points from me. The first, if I was to be advising policymakers in the area of externalization, I would emphasize the very significant legal and reputational risk that comes with these approaches, both in a hard law sense related to national, regional, and international litigation, but also, I think, reputationally on the international stage. Secondly, with respect to a recommendation around responsibility sharing, my key message here, I think, is policymakers should be creative. I think both Jeff and I have been fairly critical of the GCR today, and I think for good reason. On the other hand, the GCR is a smorgasbord of policy options to be taken up by states interested in contributing to responsibility sharing. So this could be increased resettlement, it could be pilots around humanitarian admission or community sponsorship, which has significant momentum currently. It could be support for asylum capacity in third states, which is often overlooked. And of course, all this should be against the background of maintaining access to asylum. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nick. And thank you all, Jens, Jeff, Sitara, Monica, Nick, for a wonderful panel and for your contributions today. Again, reminding you there are many good questions out in the chat, so if you have the time and there are things that can be answered there. Without further ado, I'll hand over to you, Sergio Carrera, who you are the Senior Research Fellow and Head of the Justice and Home Affairs Unit at CIPS. Thank you very much. Over to you, Sergio.
Thank you, Catherine, also for wonderfully sharing this session, which has been extremely timely and interesting. And I would like to thank all of you, the Asylum Project partners who initiated this event, and of course all the guest speakers and all of you who are still with us, all the participants. And I think it is something that the project is aiming at, bringing together academic conversations with civil society practitioners and public policies, and by unpacking the notion of externalization, how important it is, how important it is to know what are we talking about precisely. And I think Jeff's contributions and Nick's contributions are extremely important in that regard, particularly at times of differentiating the specificity of proposals such as the Danish asylum law from other facets or phases of externalization, how specific it is, the idea of extraterritorial processing. And I was particularly interested to hear from Nick's presentation how the Danish law expressly states that this idea will fly unless it will be in breach of Denmark's international obligations. Well, guess what? It is despite the Danish minister's speech at the European Parliament's Libe Committee on the 13th of January, where he said that the proposal is perfectly in line with European international obligations. I will kindly invite the minister to read the United Nations Human Rights Council Universal Periodic Review comments on Denmark and Australia. On Denmark, the one published in February 2021, which compiles information on the country, the Human Rights Committee raised serious concerns as to how the Danish government is not complying with the principle of non-refoulement in policies returning migrants and asylum seekers, particularly as regards the role of individual asylum procedures. And the Danish authorities, I was reading the UPR report on Denmark, replied, saying, all is good, we have individual asylum procedures and rejected cases have access to refugee appeals board. The question then is how this new proposal will fly in light of the Human Rights Committee concerns. And not only that, I mean, I would also invite Danish officials to read the UPR conclusions on Australia, where several UN bodies and special procedures have consistently underlined the incompatibility of the offshoring policy of Australia with UN treaties. It is absolutely clear, and in fact, there are several governments around the world that have expressly called Australia to halt that policy because it's openly against Australia's international obligations. So now, it is very well documented, and CEPS has in the past conducted a feasibility study of existing offshoring asylum proposals, such as in Australia, but also these United Nations sources. It is amply documented how this leads to systematic violations of the principle of non-refoulement, to arbitrary arrest and detention, to procedural unfairness. What else do we need to know? What else do we need to know? Now, in terms of EU law, it is not for the Danish minister to conclude whether the proposal is in compliance with EU law. It will be ultimately for courts and national parliaments also to consider, because yes, Denmark has an opt-out, but Denmark does participate in the Dublin regulation. Now, if this proposal continues, I think this will be an end of mutual trust of Danish authorities in the Dublin regulation. It will imply halting the participation of Denmark in the Dublin regulation, as clearly the country will become unsafe. So there will be no transfers. Danish authorities can forget about transfers. And, also Denmark is bound by the EU Charter, Fundamental Rights, that enshrines a right to seek asylum. So what about that? I mean, has anybody really thought about how this idea genuinely poses serious problem with EU law? So this idea of coalition of the unwilling to comply with their international and European obligations is extremely problematic. It is not a question of aspirations for Denmark or any other government to comply with international obligations and European obligations. They have to do it. And if they don't do it, then it's the end of trust. We cannot work anymore together. So Denmark's interests in Dublin system, it is for national parliament to consider very carefully. What will that mean to end cooperation under the Dublin regulation for a country like Denmark? So, in the Asylum project, and I will end with this, the global compacts have been presented as political, non-legally binding instruments. However, they're both anchored in existing international human rights and refugee protection. Here also, it's not for countries to choose, pick and choose. they have committed voluntarily to these international treaties and conventions. So I think the discussion of today showed how important it is for, when we test feasibility of these ideas, to seriously consider those obligations as part of the assessment of feasibility. And, is it really realistic? I think it was Jeff, I think, these policymakers are simply too naive. I mean, perhaps a reality test will be very welcomed in terms of what are they actually talking about, and what we know the effects of these policies are for people, and this call by Sitara for humanizing the debates. I mean, some decency by policymakers would be my recommendation, indeed, when putting forward this kind of initiatives. So I would like to thank everybody, and we'll certainly continue exploring these issues in the ASAL project and doing the research we're doing in the ASAL project. So big thanks, everyone. Thank you for your participation.